He's here. Say something.
I hear.
Mike Kinsley. Brett Brown.
Here.
Bill Nicholas.
Here.
James Anaya.
Here.
Bill Tambito. Here. Aaron Myers. John Ray.
Here.
Ed Wilcox.
Here.
Jerry Wallstrom is absent. Herb Rubin.
Here.
Okay. We have the minutes of the 28th and the 27th. There you go. Is that better? Put on my radio voice. We have the meeting minutes of the 28th and the 27th in front of us here. Everyone's had a chance to review them. Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
So
as
moved.
presented? It's been moved by Glenn.
Second.
Seconded by Ed. Any discussion on those or changes? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. The bulk of the meeting today, then, is to review the input of the rental inspection and licensing options. Maybe we could start, I don't see it on the agenda, but I'd kind of like to start with the redlining document here that you guys have spent so much time on, and take a look at it. And, yes, Bill, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but you've been sort of chairing this conference committee.
So if you please, Mayor and members of the task force, the conference committee did not meet to go over the red line version, but we appreciate George and Lance's work. And I've had some email correspondence and some face-to-face correspondence, with conversation with members of the conference committee since we got this on Friday. And I think I can say, in behalf of the members of the conference committee, that we're getting really close. We made good progress. I think the thrust of the red line versions are sympathetic to some of the key concerns of the conference committee, especially with respect to the unit-based, offender-focused approach that the later disorderly drafts were particularly concerned about. And generally speaking, the conference committee's concern about prompt and pretty aggressive notice is reflected. However, they're at the front end of the red line versions, particularly in that all-important first unlawful activity when you really want to get the attention. There is, I think it was inadvertent, but I think in the shuffle of language and text and so forth, it looks like the text that was presented in the redlining is diluting rather than reinforcing that general premise. And I don't think that was the intent. It was just the way it was done.
No, I mean, at least I don't think so. There was one particular area where the way the draft was regarding notice, it had in the ordinance itself all kinds of required forms of notice: the email, the restricted delivery, or what do I want to say? Not
registered.
Yeah, registered mail, as requirements for what I would call jurisdiction. And I think, you can put that in if you want in the final. There's nothing like illegal about it, or like completely wrong about that. The one thing, and the reason we changed it to the broader of just the first class mail, is that I think from the standpoint of policy, we would typically advise clients that you don't want a bunch of. It's very easy to avoid registered mail receipts. It's very easy. And if that's an absolute necessity to get the legally sufficient notice, you could be building in an impossibility at the gate if you don't have somebody who's going to sign for anything that comes in. We've had terrible luck with certain people who know how to avoid that very easily. So that's why we changed it. We would point out, and what we intended to point out, though, that as a policy matter, you could still require all those same kinds of notices to go out. They just wouldn't be legally preconditions to achieving legally sufficient notice. But again, the task force may find that you want all those as requirements. It's just, how do you prove somebody got an email? How do you prove, or those are the things we just wanted you to be aware of. So that's one example. Certain things we felt absolutely had to be changed, like where you were having minimum fine enhancements that were required for felony prosecutions. What you're really doing there is you're adding to what are in effect state statutes, and you don't have
Can't
the
do that.
authority to
Yeah.
do it.
Right.
You just don't. So we tried to keep those goals into effect by having the city express policy directive to seek those fine enhancements with the state's attorney's office and ask for them, and so that kind of thing. So,
Well, thank you for that clarification. I realize, Mayor, that the agenda does not anticipate that we're going to hammer out line by line.
Right.
But my thought is, and I think I speak for the conference committee on this, that we feel strongly, we are encouraged by how far we've come and where we are, and we see the finish line, and we'd like to have a session, if we could, maybe just the conference committee, which is 5 or 6 people, and Lance and George, if the city is agreeable, to hammer out in an hour or so a consensus document that then can go to the council as the product of months of work. And that's ultimately your decision and the staff's decision.
Yeah.
I'm glad Bill said that, because I have the privilege of having not looked at a lot of this stuff for close to a month. A choice of reading email with legal documents or going to biblical sites, I made a certain decision that I hope all of us would have made. But coming back, I was very impressed with it. I went through the redlining, and it really did look like a document with a lot of I's that needed a few dots and T's needing crossing, but it really, the progress from what was there a month ago was palpable. And I was going to basically make a similar suggestion to Bill that maybe we spend a reasonable amount of time in case some people here who can catch I's and T's that we can share, but then basically delegate it to the same committee that produced this thing to finish it off. So I'm basically suggesting we take a finite amount of time in case people do have comments, but then have the conference committee and the attorneys work on it to finish it.
Is that amenable to the people that are on the committee here? And is that something you could set up? Is that a phone conference? Would a phone conference be okay, or do you think that you'd need to have them drive all the way here? Or?
Maybe we could take a road trip to their office.
Okay.
yeah, or meet in the middle or whatever. Yeah, we
Okay.
could, Bill suggested.
That'd be fine, too.
Yeah.
There's a restaurant with a large table.
Right.
Okay. And you'll try to set that up in the next couple of weeks then before we meet with the city council in about a month from now.
If we can meet with you right after, then we'll work it out.
Yeah, well, we can set
Yes.
it up. Yeah, I'm gone for the rest of this week, but otherwise we could,
Possibly next week, then.
that'd be fine.
Okay.
Could
Okay,
I make
sure.
one
Yes,
point?
Brian.
I'd like to ask you a question. I think part of the task force's idea, and I've repeated this, I think, almost every time that you've been here, but it looks like the redlining removes some of the intent that we were seeking, and that is the instant notification to the landlord. I see that got abruptly changed. Could you give your reasoning on that? I know we can talk about it later.
I think, well, we can talk, I think that's what I addressed. I think we tried to keep notice, there's notice as to what you want to have happen, and then there's notice that's what's legally sufficient to get legal notice out that is effective. And so I think our thought was to broaden it, to make it more legally effective with the minimum amount of notice. That's not required. You can put it in. It's just that every level of notice that you have required becomes sufficient in order to go to the next step. So if you don't have everything in place, you can't go to the next step because you've never proved you've got binding notice at the first step. Does that make sense? And so we need to decide. You need to decide. You need to be aware of that, and you just need to know that, especially on certain forms, like there were statutes that for many years, well, one, you have lawsuits that certain lawsuits require personal service. Okay? Service can be evaded very successfully by certain people. That's why certain statutes were amended to allow for other types of service. You know, if it wasn't certain kinds of crimes, where there's certain areas. And then you had certified mail was a requirement, and we've seen that. The legislature has eased up on that with ordinance violations for administrative adjudications, so that first-class mail is legally sufficient. And all I'm saying is that as part of your desire to ensure that notice has gotten out in as many ways as possible, that's a policy directive. If it's put in the ordinance as such so that it's legally required, it can end up tripping up your ability to go to the next level where you believe you got out all the notice every which way, but we don't have that certified copy or the registered mail didn't come back. So we need to put those two different focus. They're two different aspects. The one is we want to get notice out as quickly as possible in as many ways as possible. Do we want that, all those ways, to be legally required in order to be able to go to the next level? And what are we comfortable with? So we can put some of those back if you feel comfortable with it. It's just you need to be aware of that as you're going forward.
Well, I think we were thinking more in lines of a phone call or an email or something like that. So we can be, take care of the problem as quickly as possible.
Right.
And we had, I think, one business day or 24 hours, something to that effect.
Well,
Which-
let's
and I know that's
talk
awful.
about, let's talk about maybe when we meet about what those are, how to put them in, and then maybe expressing them as a policy directive that's binding on staff, that's right in the ordinance, but make it clear what are the minimum you feel for somebody to, in effect, legally know if you got it out, certain ways.
I think what we're looking at is if something happens on a Saturday night, landlord's going to want to know about it first thing Monday morning. And that's where I think John was coming from, but we don't necessarily want to make it legally binding that call has to be made on Monday morning to satisfy.
Right, that's what we need to talk about how to phrase that.
Right.
And maybe we need to put some of that language back, but more as a directive from a standpoint of every attempt shall be made, given whatever information you have. It's kind of like in an analogous area, a temporary restraining orders, there are emergency injunctions, and there are certain things that are not required legally, but that the court system expects to have happen. So if you're trying to get an emergency order, which a judge can enter without the other side being there, if it's that much of an emergency, and you have an email address for someone, the judge expects you to have sent it. It's not legally required, but you're going to have a hard time getting a TRO if you had one. But if you didn't have one, it's not going to preclude it being entered. And so I think we need to try to phrase these notice requirements so that it's clear that they're expected for staff, but they're not necessarily, unless the ones you want to be there before you can even go to the next level, before you have authority, I guess, over that landlord. So that if you have somebody who's conveniently not getting things, and I don't know if you've ever sat through court hearings, but whenever you have default judgments, how many times, whoever says, I knew about it, but I didn't come. They always say, I never got that, one after another after another. Well, how likely is that? And that's what you need to realize is that that's what you're going to be dealt with, you're going to be faced with if you have someone that isn't compliant. If they are, we're never going to get to that step because what's going to happen? Actions are going to be taken. You're going to be working with people. You'll hear about the problems they have maybe, and you work through it. It's only when you got nothing.
Ideally, we want the police to let the landlords know right away.
Right.
So that they can deal with the issue right away. But if for some reason they're out of town, they miss that Monday or Tuesday phone call, that shouldn't be necessarily a deal breaker for counting that incident towards this ordinance.
Right, and of course, from an enforcement perspective, even if notice got out late, but it was just, if you have somebody who, once they get it, they react, it's not going to be an issue because you're going to then get that dialogue going.
And
we're only talking about where the dialogue never gets started.
Right, and along that, if I could just throw this in there, and I've had this personally happen between me and the state where a governmental body basically, they're having a brain fart. Their position is if they put it in the mail, you received it.
Right.
And I know from personal experience that that's not always the case, whether it's an address change or it got lost somewhere at a sorting facility or something. So I would think that a requirement beyond just a first-class letter would be preferable.
You know, you might, when you address those things, sometimes an affidavit of mailing just signed off by somebody says, yeah, I put it in the mail today, first-class mail, postage prepaid, some sort of record.
Yeah, that's what, I mean, I
That
don't know
might
how
help.
your administrative adjudication proceedings I heard, but I'm familiar with that, whereas part of the filing, as part of the record, that's exactly what happens. And also there's always a requirement that there be a return address with that individual inspector's name on the envelope so that if it were to be returned as undeliverable, it would come back to someone who knew what it was and it wouldn't just get pitched.
Yep. So the landlord has, if there's a sequence of timed responses that starts, they want to have some comfort level that the time actually did officially start at some point. And the other is just, there is a response provision for landlords to respond, but it looks like regular mail's not good enough for them. I think we would want that in there as well.
Absolutely.
Email,
If
fax
it's
is
good enough
okay,
to want.
registered's not okay, personal service is okay, but, you know.
Yeah, and we could put in some language about how where information is had regarding, say, email addresses or phone numbers, staff is directed to use all those venues to send out the same notice, but also saying, but those aren't necessarily necessary in order to achieve. So that, they'll go out, but it's just in order to give as much notice as possible, not in order to achieve what I would call jurisdiction over.
Right. But, if it's okay for the city to get by with just first-class mail, then the response should also be allowed by first-class mail.
Well, those are probably the things I guess we'll.
Right. I'm just throwing out things to consider when you're going over,
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about notices between landlords and communication with the city. And I think this committee originally started out by saying the most important thing is that we have continued communication between the police department and the landlords and the city and the landlords. And I think the committee wants not just a notice when